August 30th, 1961. A beautiful evening marks this late summer season. The location is the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena, the largest covered auditorium in the United States. Just a year before, it had been host to the 1960 Democratic National Convention in July, as you can see in this panoramic photo of that event, when John F. Kennedy was selected as the Democratic nominee for that fall's election. But this evening, in August 1961, a totally different crowd is streaming into the arena. For the first time since its opening 2 years before, all of the arena's 16,000 seats are filled. Thousands of unlucky people who could not get in have gathered outside, hoping to capture some of the inside excitement from loudspeakers which had been rushed onto the spot. Solemnity, emergency, fervor, collective dedication, and apprehension are in the air. The atmosphere is that of a well-organized, large-scale, old-fashioned evangelical camp. Coming from all over South California, the crowd is mostly composed of well-dressed, middle-class people wearing their Sunday best, many of whom have brought their children. Scores of high school students, representing more than 30 California Southland cities, are also present. These young people are admitted free of charge because this, the third evening of the week-long Southern California School of Anti-Communism, being held in the arena, has been advertised as Youth Dedication Night. The messages presented would have a particular emphasis on children and teens and the responsibilities of their parents. Although the Memorial Sports Arena is normally used by the Lakers, the city's new basketball franchise, tonight's crowd has not come for sports. Rather, it has come to proclaim its patriotism and its opposition to communism. A Marine color guard enters the arena carrying the Old Glory over an organ prelude, thus generating from the audience a spontaneous 90-second applause and a subsequent singing of the Star-Spangled Banner. Following this comes a rendition of the Pledge of Allegiance, read by anti-communist star Herbert Philbrick, acting as master of ceremonies for the evening. If you are old enough to remember his name, you realize that Herb was the man who infiltrated communist groups in America for the FBI in the 1940s and wrote a book in 1952 about his experiences that were the basis for the 1950s TV show I Led 3 Lives. This was followed by the singing of the Protestant hymn, God of Our Fathers, performed by a youth choir, accompanied by the popular church band World Vision Quartet, shown here when they performed for a Billy Graham crusade. The night's first speaker discreetly walks onto the arena's center stage, Marion Miller, a local celebrity in West Los Angeles, whose story was popularized by a series of Reader's Digest articles. Her autobiography, I Was a Spy, The Story of a Brave Housewife, tells of how she infiltrated on a voluntary basis a local left-wing group, the activities of which were deemed suspicious by the FBI. Flanked by her 3 children, the housewife calls for a national program to educate Americans on the evils of communism. In implicit terms, she attacks the Los Angeles School Board that recently decided, amid controversy, to keep in its archives a series of films about Russia and Red China. Miller then gives up the stage for a much-cheered movie and television star. And here he is, Ronald Reagan, on the cover of the 1961 LP record album that contained his urgent message to the public, attacking Social Security and socialized medicine, his term for the proposed Medicare program, which was enacted in 1965 in spite of his protests. In a moment, you will hear what he had to say on that recording. This recording was put up on YouTube in 2009 and has had over 200,000 views since then. It was obviously uploaded not as just a mildly interesting piece of history, but by someone who thought that Reagan's words in 1961 were critically important for people in 2009 to hear. How do I know this? Because he chose to put photos in the background, such as ones of Obama, that literally make it seem like Reagan was talking about the plans for Obamacare. The person who uploaded it wants viewers like you to accept and agree with Reagan's warning. And he was pretty successful, as it triggered effusive praise of the 1980s presidential administration of Ronald Reagan and/or rants against Obama and socialized medicine in most of the comments below the video. By the way, it's not mentioned on the cover of the recording, and it wasn't mentioned on the YouTube page where it appears, but Reagan made this recording specifically at the request of the American Medical Association, the AMA.
My name is Ronald Reagan. I have been asked to talk on several subjects that have to do with the problems of the day. Now, back in 1927, an American socialist, Norman Thomas, 6 times candidate for president on the Socialist Party ticket, said the American people would never vote for socialism. But he said under the name of liberalism, the American people will adopt every fragment of the socialist program. There are many ways in which our government has invaded the precincts of private citizens, the method of earning a living. One of the traditional methods of imposing statism or socialism on a people has been by way of medicine. It's very easy to disguise a medical program as a humanitarian project. Most people are a little reluctant to oppose anything that suggests medical care for people who possibly can't afford it. James Madison, in 1788, speaking to the Virginia Convention, said, "Since the general civilization of mankind, I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations." Now, in our country, under our free enterprise system, we have seen medicine reach the greatest heights that it has in any country in the world. Today, the relationship between patient and doctor in this country is something to be envied any place. The privacy, the care that is given to a person, the right to choose a doctor, the right to go from one doctor to the other. But let's also look from the other side at the freedom the doctor loses. A doctor would be reluctant to say this. Well, like you, I'm only a patient, so I can say it in his behalf. The doctor begins to lose freedoms. It's like telling a lie, and one leads to another. First, you decide that the doctor can have so many patients. They're equally divided among the various doctors by the government. But then the doctors aren't equally divided geographically. So a doctor decides he wants to practice in one town, and the government has to say to him, you can't live in that town. They already have enough doctors. You have to go someplace else. And from here, it's only a short step to dictating where he will go. This is a freedom that I wonder whether any of us have the right to take from any human being. Take it into your own occupation or that of your husband. All of us can see what happens once you establish the precedent that the government can determine a man's working place and his working methods, determine his employment. From here, it's a short step to all the rest of socialism, to determining his pay. And pretty soon, your son won't decide when he's in school where he will go or what he will do for a living. He will wait for the government to tell him where he will go to work and what he will do. In this country of ours took place the greatest revolution that has ever taken place in world history, the only true revolution. Every other revolution simply exchanged one set of rulers for another. But here, for the first time in all the thousands of years of man's relation to man, a little group of men, the Founding Fathers, for the first time, established the idea that you and I had within ourselves the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. This freedom was built into our government with safeguards. We talk democracy today, and strangely we let democracy begin to assume the aspect of majority rule is all that is needed. Well, majority rule is a fine aspect of democracy, provided there are guarantees written in to our government concerning the rights of the individual and of the minorities. What can we do about this? Well, you and I can do a great deal. We can write to our congressmen, to our senators. We can say right now that we want no further encroachment on these individual liberties and freedoms. And at the moment, the key issue is we do not want socialized medicine. If you don't, this program, I promise you, will pass just as surely as the sun will come up tomorrow. And behind it will come other federal programs that will invade every area of freedom as we have known it in this country. Until, one day, as Norman Thomas said, we will awake to find that we have socialism. And if you don't do this, and if I don't do it, one of these days, you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in America when men were free.
But on this August 1961 evening at the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena, he's speaking to an enthusiastic live audience. With commanding oratory refined after years of spokesmanship for the General Electric Corporation, Reagan states that youth is now a priority for communists. You are a target. Communism will appeal to your rebellious nature. They will make you feel your patriotism is hollow. Then they will fill up the vacuum with their philosophy. The speaker decries the trend toward the welfare state and centralized government. He states that these are as dangerous for America as is communism. These advocates of the welfare state fail to realize our loss is just as great if it happens on the installment plan. After Reagan's short, effective speech, the audience gets on its feet to welcome star singer and Christian activist Pat Boone. He loses no time before singing a few numbers from his R&B pop repertoire and generates the audience's wildest reaction with the following words. I don't want to live in a communist United States. I would rather see my 4 girls shot and die as little girls who have faith in God than leave them to die some years later as godless, faithless, soulless communists. In other words, Pat is sure that they would be better dead than red. The outburst of emotion dies down. Master of Ceremonies Philbrick then takes the stage and delivers a didactic speech concerning Cold War politics. He berates the Defense Department for muzzling military leaders from speaking out against the Red Menace and calls for a congressional investigation on the issue. The 3-hour rally continues with testimonies offered by stars like John Wayne, Roy Rogers, and Dale Evans, interspersed with songs such as This Is My Country and Battle Hymn of the Republic. Sporadic references to conservative heroes like General Douglas MacArthur or Senators Strom Thurmond and Barry Goldwater are welcomed by cheers. And now Fred Schwartz, 48-year-old president of the Christian anti-communism crusade, appears. The coming of the Australian doctor-turned-professional anti-communist does not generate the same frenzy as do Reagan or Boone. However, the authority of the man who masterminded this anti-communist Woodstock shines through. The Australian is a dark-complexioned, middle-aged man with scant hair. His mostly expressionless, rigid, and long-nosed face contrasts with eyes which twinkle behind huge, horn-rimmed glasses when he makes a point. His high-pitched Australian twang could be a distraction for this audience. However, it isn't, since the good doctor's eloquence allows him to hold the audience's attention and melt away cultural barriers. As usual, Schwartz never uses notes when speaking. He sums up the evening's main points and reiterates, as he often does, that the greatest need that confronts us today is that we have knowledge of the enemy that threatens to destroy us. In a lecture, the delivery and efficiency of which has been proved tested countless times before, Schwartz outlines the communist blueprint for world conquest by various means: military power, propaganda, demoralization, duplicity, and sympathy generated among youth and intellectuals. The anti-communist crusader wraps up his speech by a fiery proclamation of his faith that the final victory over communism will come through the assertion of the free world's most important assets: respect for authority, God, country, and freedom. The evening concludes with a Statue of Liberty candle-lighting finale and the singing of God Bless America. I was surprised when I first read about this splashy 1961 California event not long ago, that featured so many familiar names like Pat Boone, John Wayne, and Roy Rogers. In August 1961, I was getting ready to start my sophomore year in high school in a small town in far northern Michigan. I don't ever remember having heard anything about anti-communism in my school classes. Oh, I did watch I Led Three Lives on TV from 1953 to 1956 when I was in grade school, but as a naive child, the program didn't seem any different to me than Dragnet. I had no real idea what a communist was. It was just stories of good guys versus bad guys. As a young teen in August 1961, I was wrapped up in listening to the latest hit records on the radio and planning my new wardrobe for the coming school year. Thus, I was pretty oblivious to all but the most startling world and national news, and almost totally ignorant or unaware about national issues from segregation in the South to labor unrest across the nation. I certainly knew nothing about the John Birch Society or any of the rest of the anti-communist subculture in the nation at the time. I still remember coming home from school for lunch in the spring of second grade in 1954 to find my mother, like the mother in this photo, glued to the black and white TV, watching the Army McCarthy hearings. I had no idea what that was all about, just that Mom wasn't watching her usual Arthur Godfrey show or soaps like Search for Tomorrow. It wasn't until many years later that I learned about the Red Scare that started in the late 1940s and the activities of the House Un-American Activities Committee and the so-called communist witch hunts of Senator Joseph McCarthy, and about the Senate Army McCarthy hearings that led to the downfall of McCarthy. Only then did I realize those Senate hearings were what had Mom glued to the TV all day for weeks that spring. As mentioned in a previous Strange Brew episode, the forerunner to the post-World War II House Un-American Activities Committee was formed in 1938 and referred to informally as the Dies Committee after its chairman, conservative Congressman Martin Dies. Its original formal title was the House Committee on Un-American Activities, later morphing to House Un-American Activities Committee, or the HUAC. Upon its formation as a temporary committee in 1938, the official role of the House Un-American Activities Committee was to investigate communist and fascist organizations that had become active during the Great Depression, though it also examined the activities of other groups on the political left. From the outset, the committee proved to be a source of political discord. Its defenders argued it uncovered vital information that bolstered national security, while critics charged it was a partisan tool bent on discrediting the New Deal programs of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Its original mandate back in the 1930s included investigating alleged disloyalty and subversive activities on the part of private citizens and public employees, as well as those organizations suspected of having communist or fascist ties. It usually concentrated its efforts on communists. In 1938, Dies relocated to Los Angeles to attempt to ferret out individual communists he believed were hiding in the entertainment industry. In 1940, a former Communist Party organizer named John Leach had provided the Dies Committee with a list of actors he accused of holding leftist ideas. His list included Humphrey Bogart, Frederick March, Franchot Tone, James Cagney, Louise Rainier, Francis Lederer, and Jean Muir. Dies declared that these actors would be cleared if they would appear at a Dies Committee hearing. If they did not agree to a meeting, he announced he would find them guilty of anti-American activity. As you can see from this news article, Franchot Tone cooperated. But barely a year later, anti-communist sentiments took a back seat in the country and the Congress when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and stayed that way through World War II, especially once Russia became an ally and played the key role in stopping the Nazis. Over the years the temporary committee was in operation, many congressmen came to resent the committee's costs and its tendency to conduct what many considered to be mere witch hunts. So it was widely assumed that the committee would lapse after Dies's retirement in early 1945, but it was not to be. At the last moment, Representative John E. Rankin of Mississippi, one of the founders of the HUAC, stepped in. Rankin was a rabid segregationist who over the years had introduced bills to make interracial marriage a federal crime. He had opposed bills making lynching a federal crime throughout the 1920s, arguing that such bills fostered black-on-white rapes and would result in the destruction of the white man's civilization throughout the world. And as part of the HUAC, he had refused to investigate the Ku Klux Klan because they were, he insisted, an old American institution. As with many segregationists, he was convinced that it was direct communist agitation that prompted Negroes to begin demanding civil rights. Rankin didn't confine his racism to blacks. He was just as bigoted toward Jews as he was blacks, and was convinced that the Jews, whom he blamed for the communist revolution in Russia in 1917, had the same goal as the blacks, to destroy right Christian people worldwide. Rankin was equally anti-Oriental. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, he declared, "I'm for catching every Japanese in America, Alaska, and Hawaii now, and putting them in concentration camps. Damn them. Let's get rid of them now." Like Hitler, Rankin had the same obsession with blood, and he demanded to keep Japanese and African Americans from donating blood for fear of contaminating whites. As you might imagine, John Rankin held very strong views about the United Nations when it came into being, as seen in this famous quote, "The United Nations is the greatest fraud in history. Its purpose is to destroy the United States." So, as the authorization for the temporary HUAC was about to lapse, Congressman Rankin stepped in, outmaneuvering House leaders and introducing a resolution to instead confer on the HUAC full permanent status at the opening of the 79th Congress in January 1945. The resolution passed, and thus, at the height of the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, HUAC's influence soared and contributed to a climate of domestic fear stoked by its sensational and often unsubstantiated investigations. In the coming years, the HUAC went on to cooperate extensively with the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover in attempting to hunt down commies, often referred to as Reds, and commie sympathizers, often sneeringly referred to as Pinkos. Its new mandate as a permanent standing committee was to investigate suspected threats of subversion or propaganda that attacked the form of government as guaranteed by our Constitution. Under this mandate, the 9-man committee focused its investigations on real and suspected communists in positions of actual or supposed influence in United States society. And thus, by 1947, Hollywood found itself back in the crosshairs of the committee. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had become particularly alarmed at some of the content of recent motion pictures, which seemed to be subversive of what was viewed by the Bureau as the American way of life. Hoover and his henchmen saw in these films hints that the screenwriters had been influenced by communist ideas. Take that schmaltzy 1946 movie, It's a Wonderful Life, with lovable Jimmy Stewart playing a troubled George Bailey. Even though it seemed like just a fluffy little feel-good Christmas movie, the FBI snooped around and sensed it was hiding a sinister undercurrent of Pinko ideas. They reported their findings to the HUAC. From 1942 to 1958, the Los Angeles Field Office investigated more than 200 movies, fearing they had been turned into weapons of communist propaganda, as John A. Noakes wrote in The Cold War and the Movies. The FBI generally looked into films connected to personalities associated with the Communist Party, which is what drew them to It's a Wonderful Life. The FBI claimed that two of its screenwriters, Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett, were very close to known communists and on one occasion in the recent past practically lived with known communists and were observed eating lunch every day with known communists. So an agent watched the movie and wrote a report claiming it represented a rather obvious attempt to discredit bankers. For example, the report said, the film cast Lionel Barrymore as Mr. Potter, the Scrooge type, so that he would be the most hated man in the picture. On its face, that's true. The plot wouldn't work if the crowd were cheering for Potter to repossess Bailey's business. But the FBI agent claimed that according to informants, this was a common trick used by communists. The agent's grievances didn't stop there. The report claimed the movie deliberately maligned the upper class, attempting to show the people who had money were mean and despicable characters. The FBI argued the movie could have portrayed Mr. Potter as following the rules as laid down by the state bank examiners in connection with making loans. Have a look at the famous speech by Jimmy Stewart as George Bailey, aimed at Barrymore's sneering Mr. Potter, and see what you think.
Borrow money. What does that get us? A discontented, lazy rabble instead of a thrifty working class. And all because a few starry-eyed dreamers like Peter Bailey stir 'em up and fill their head with a lot of impossible ideas. Now, I say...
Just a minute, just a minute. Now, hold on, Mr. Potter. Just a minute. Now, you're right when you say my father was no businessman. I know that. Why he ever started this cheap penny-ante building and loan, I'll never know. But neither you nor anybody else can say anything against his character because his whole life was... Why, in the 25 years since he and Uncle Billy started this thing, he never once thought of himself. Isn't that right, Uncle Billy? He didn't save enough money to send Harry to school, let alone me. But he did help a few people get out of your slums, Mr. Potter. And what's wrong with that? Well, here, you're all businessmen here. Doesn't make them better citizens? Doesn't make them better customers? You said that they... What'd you say just a minute ago? They had to wait and save their money before they even thought of a decent home? Wait for what? Until their children grow up and leave them? Until they're so old and broken down that you know how long it takes a working man to save $5,000? Just remember this, Mr. Potter, that this rabble you're talking about, they do most of the working and paying and living and dying in this community. Well, is it too much to have them work and pay and live and die in a couple of decent rooms and a bath? Anyway, my father didn't think so. People were human beings to him, but to you, a warped, frustrated old man, they're cattle. Well, in my book, he died a much richer man than you'll ever be.
I'm not interested in your book. I'm talking about the building and loan.
I know very well what you're talking about. You're talking about something you can't get your fingers on, and it's galling you. That's what you're talking about, I know. Well, I've said too much. You're the board here. You do what you want with this thing. There's just one thing more, though. This town needs this measly one-horse institution, if only to have some place where people can come without crawling to Potter. Come on.
The report about the movie was submitted to the HUAC for its consideration. In spite of the efforts of Hoover's men to smear the film, the HUAC ultimately chose not to take any action against it and allowed it to continue being shown in theaters that year. But that doesn't imply that they didn't still have an eagle eye focused on Hollywood.
Calling the House Un-American Activities Committee to order, Chairman J. Parnell Thomas of New Jersey opens an inquiry into possible communist penetration of the Hollywood film industry. The committee is seeking to determine if Red Party members have reached the screen with subversive propaganda. Mr. Thomas takes an impartial stand in his opening talk.
I want to emphasize at the outset of these hearings that the fact that the Committee on Un-American Activities is investigating alleged communist influence and infiltration in the moving picture industry must not be considered or interpreted as an attack on the industry itself, nor should our investigation be interpreted as an attack on the majority of persons associated with this great industry. I have every confidence that the vast majority of movie workers are patriotic and loyal Americans.
A long list of prominent motion picture witnesses appear before the committee. Speaking for the films, Eric Johnston, president of the Motion Picture Association, talks frankly concerning the attitude of the producers.
We're accused of having communists and communist sympathizers in our employ. Undoubtedly, there are such persons in Hollywood, as you will find elsewhere in America. but we neither shield nor defend them. We want them exposed. We're not responsible for the political or economic ideas of any individual, but we are responsible for what goes on the screen. We guard that with great care. If communists have attempted to inject their propaganda into the motion picture, they have failed miserably. We will never permit them to succeed.
In 1947, the committee held 9 days of hearings into alleged communist propaganda and influence in the Hollywood motion picture industry. They focused their attention in particular on 10 Hollywood producers, directors, and screenwriters shown here. After conviction on contempt of Congress charges for refusal to answer some questions posed by committee members, most of the group, later referred to as the Hollywood 10, were sentenced to up to a year in prison. And all were blacklisted by the industry, meaning that they were branded as undesirables and rejected for any role in filmmaking. Eventually, more than 300 people in the industry, including directors, radio commentators, actors, and particularly screenwriters, were blacklisted by the studios. Some, like Charlie Chaplin, Orson Welles, and Paul Robeson, left the United States and built careers in Europe. Others, like screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, who had been one of the Hollywood 10, went underground, writing under pseudonyms or the names of colleagues in order to earn a living. Some historians speculate only about 10% of those blacklisted succeeded in rebuilding successful careers within the entertainment industry. Here is just one sample story of a career short-circuited by the Red Scare. On March 21, 1951, the name of the actor Lionel Stander was uttered by the actor Larry Parks during testimony before HUAC. "Do you know Lionel Stander?" Committee Counsel Frank S. Tavener inquired. Parks replied he knew the man, but had no knowledge of his political affiliations. No more was said about Stander either by Parks or the committee. No accusation, no insinuation. Yet Stander's phone stopped ringing. Prior to Parks' testimony, Stander had worked on 10 television shows in the previous 100 days. Afterwards, nothing. When Stander was himself called before the HUAC in 1953, he began by pledging his full support in the fight against subversive activities. "I know of a group of fanatics who are desperately trying to undermine the Constitution of the United States by depriving artists and others of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness without due process of law. I can name names and cite instances, and I am one of the first victims of it. This is a group of ex-fascists and America Firsters and anti-Semites, people who hate everybody, including Negroes, minority groups, and most likely themselves. These people are engaged in a conspiracy outside all the legal processes to undermine the very fundamental American concepts upon which our entire system of democracy exists." Stander was clearly speaking of the HUAC committee itself. Stander had been in over 50 films since 1932, had been one of the founding members of the Screen Actors Guild in 1933. But after the 1951 incident with the HUAC, he didn't work in film again in America for almost 30 years. As with many blacklisted U.S. actors, he emigrated to Europe and found acting work there. He didn't return to the U.S. until 1979, when he was cast in the role of the butler on the TV series Heart to Heart that starred Robert Wagner and Stephanie Powers. Stander won an Emmy for that role as Best Supporting Actor in 1983. It wasn't just the film industry that was affected by the tactic of blacklisting either, both by the HUAC's activities and the activities of independent anti-communist groups, such as the one that published this little tract. Radio, and eventually even more so, TV, became targets. Americans, don't patronize Reds. You can drive the Reds out of television, radio, and Hollywood. This tract will tell you how. Why we must drive them out. Number 1, the Reds have made our screen, radio, and TV Moscow's most effective fifth column in America. Number 2, the Reds of Hollywood and Broadway have always been the chief financial support of our communist propaganda in America. Number 3, our own films made by Red producers, directors, writers, and stars are being used by Moscow in Asia, Africa, the Balkans, and throughout Europe to create hatred of America. Number 4, right now films are being made to craftily glorify Marxism, UNESCO, and one-worldism, and via your TV set they are being piped into your living room and are poisoning the minds of your children under your very eyes. So remember, if you patronize a film made by Red producers, writers, stars, and studios, you are aiding and abetting communism. Every time you permit Reds to come into your living room via your TV set, you are helping Moscow and the internationalists to destroy America. But how was a loyal American and loyal American TV networks to know just which producers and writers and stars were part of this insidious fifth column? No problem. On June 22, 1950, copies of this little book were distributed to network executives along Madison Avenue. Red Channels, the report of communist influence in radio and television. It named names specifically, listing 151 actors, writers, musicians, broadcast journalists, and others in the industry, and provided supposed evidence that those named had communist ties of some sort. Thus, the networks would have all the information they needed to clean out the red and pinko shows and actors from their lineups. And if they by chance ignored it, the book was widely available to the public, and loyal Americans could write and call the networks to demand immediate action. In 1947, a private group of men dedicated to the anti-communist cause, including 3 former FBI agents and an original National Council member of the John Birch Society, had begun publishing a newsletter titled Counterattack. The Red Channels book was issued by them in 1950 as a special report. An episode on NPR's All Things Considered program in 2010 described the stunning power of the book. Red Channels, the report of communist influence in radio and television, arrived quietly and discreetly. No headlines, no TV coverage. There seemed to be something a little dirty about it from the start. Some executives wouldn't even admit to having seen a copy. But Red Channels was soon the most public secret in the industry. Among the prominent names it listed were Orson Welles, Leonard Bernstein, Arthur Miller, Lena Horne, Edward R. Murrow, and Artie Shaw. Its vigilante crusade was serious business. For example, early in 1951, George Burns introduced a new cast member on the Burns and Allen Show, John Brown. But Brown had been listed in Red Channels. After 6 months, he was dropped. There were a lot of stories like that. One of those stories involved 33-year-old actress Marcia Hunt, who had been in movies since she was 17 in 1933. She was popular enough in Hollywood to have done a screen test at age 22 to play Melanie Hamilton in Gone with the Wind, and was a strong contender for the part that eventually went to Olivia de Havilland. NPR interviewed her for the All Things Considered program about Red Channels. I was a film actress who was doing more television than anyone else because I was in New York doing plays, explains actress Marcia Hunt. 1950 looked like a banner year for her. Then in July, her agent called with some strange news. 3 different networks had offered me an ongoing show of my own on television, so I was waiting to hear from the 3 networks. And I never did. And my agent explained this with two words which I had never heard before: red channels, and that anyone listed in that accusatory, privately published pamphlet was just not welcome on the air anymore. As her agent described the new order, Hunt found it almost too bizarre to be true. My reaction to hearing of something called red channels was disbelief at first, and then, though I would never have a copy of it in the house, the citations, the 6 items listed by my name, were read to me over the phone. And yes, indeed, I'd been there, I'd done that, I'd said that or signed something, all things I believed in, and I was amazed to learn they were considered subversive in some way. Operating out of a small office on West 42nd Street, Red Channels projected an influence that affected hiring decisions at the networks, the ad agencies, and some of the largest advertisers in the country. It was all done quietly, behind closed doors at first. The public was still largely unaware of red channels until it caught the spotlight with the Gene Muir case in August 1950. Another longtime Hollywood actress who had also been considered for the part of Melanie, Gene Muir, had also started in films in 1933 and was about 40 when Red Channels came out in 1950. That summer, NBC cast actress Gene Muir in The Aldrich Family, a TV show based on a popular radio teenage situation comedy by that name that had been on the air since 1939. Muir's name had already appeared in Red Channels, but no one considered that important yet. Only when the sponsor, General Foods, makers of Bird's Eye frozen foods, began receiving protest letters did anyone take another look. In August, Muir was replaced before the first program aired. Unlike with Brown or Hunt, the Muir case was widely reported, along with the role played by Red Channels. The squalor of it all was embarrassing to the networks and advertisers. They decided they wanted distance and deniability. Some thought it might break the blacklist. Instead, it merely drove the process even deeper behind closed doors. Marcia Hunt says, "At the time in New York, there was no procedure set up to try to clear your name. I did, on my own volition, write a letter to each of the major networks explaining I knew nothing or cared nothing about communism, and that I did my best to be a good citizen during World War II, and that I hoped this would clear any confusion, and that I would be permitted to resume work. I never had any kind of response to that. Authorities were not interested in letters. They preferred a mix of humiliation and atonement. You had to repent any official stand you may have taken, such as signing a petition for something you believed in. You had to repent all those activities that were cited under your name in Red Channels, and to swear lifelong hatred and opposition to the Communist Party. The decline of the blacklist was slow but steady by the late 1950s, until it was largely broken by a lawsuit in '62. Today, in 2010, Marcia Hunt is 92, still active, and in a small way, still a victim of the blacklist period. She finds that a little puzzling. I must tell you that the interest in the blacklist era never seems to die down. I'm constantly asked about it. And the one real regret I have about this today is that I may be remembered, and I hope not, for having been blacklisted rather than for the work that I've done as an actor. By the way, since Marcia Hunt was already 92 when that 2010 program aired, you might expect she would no longer be alive. You would expect wrong. As this docu-commentary is being recorded in January 2020, Hunt is still alive at 102. She had a fruitful career in entertainment again eventually, and has for over 60 years been extremely active in humanitarian work locally in California, nationally, and internationally. She's given speeches, raised funds, and produced TV shows about such topics as third world hunger, homelessness in California, mental illness, global pollution, worldwide poverty, and more. Here's just one more story from the many lives and careers disrupted by red channels. One of the names on the published list was popular folk singer Pete Seeger. Pete, along with friend Lee Hayes, had started the folk group called the Weavers in the late 1940s. The Weavers were one of the most significant music groups of the post-war era, but their career was nearly destroyed during the Red Scare of the early 1950s. The importance of the Weavers to the folk revival of the late 1950s cannot be overstated. Without the group that Pete Seeger founded with Lee Hayes in Greenwich Village in 1948, there would likely be no Bob Dylan, not to mention no Kingston Trio or Peter, Paul and Mary. The Weavers helped spark a tremendous resurgence in interest in American folk traditions and folk songs when they burst onto the popular scene with Goodnight Irene, a #1 record for 13 weeks in the summer and fall of 1950. The Weavers sold millions of copies of innocent, beautiful, and utterly apolitical records like Midnight Special and On Top of Old Smoky that year. And then it came to light that members of the group had openly embraced the pacifism, internationalism, and pro-labor sympathies of the Communist Party during the 1930s. When word of their political past spread, the backlash was swift. The Weavers' planned television show was canceled, the group was placed under FBI surveillance, and Seeger and Hayes were called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. The Weavers lost their recording contract with Decca in 1951, and by 1953, unable to book most concert venues and banned from appearing on television and radio, they disbanded. The Weavers enjoyed a significant comeback in the late 1950s, but the group never shook its right-wing antagonists. On the afternoon of January 2, 1962, in advance of a scheduled appearance on The Jack Paar Show, the Weavers were told by NBC officials that their appearance would be canceled if they would not sign a statement disavowing the Communist Party. Every member of the Weavers refused to sign. This is a photo of the actual entry in the Red Channels book for Marcia Hunt, which led to her being blacklisted. It cites various groups and activities she had been involved in, which led to suspicions she had communist connections or leanings. One charge is that she was a speaker at a rally protesting the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947 related to the arrest of the Hollywood 10. It was only recently that I became aware of just how many people whose names were very familiar to me from the entertainment industry had been smeared by the Red Channel's listing. Here are just a few more of them. Leonard Bernstein, Lee J. Cobb, Aaron Copland, Jose Ferrer, Will Geer, who won an Emmy in 1975 for his role on the Waltons TV series, Ruth Gordon, Dashiell Hammett, Lillian Hellman, Judy Holliday, Lena Horne, Burl Ives, Gypsy Rose Lee, Burgess Meredith, Arthur Miller, author of the plays Death of a Salesman and The Crucible, Edward G. Robinson, Pete Seeger, Orson Welles, Eddie Albert, Harry Belafonte, Charlie Chaplin, Dolores Del Rio, and even Bill Melendez, the animator of the Charlie Brown TV specials in the 1960s and 70s. It also surprised me a few years back when I discovered one name that wasn't directly connected to the efforts of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And I'm betting quite a few Americans, even ones like me who lived during the Red Scare era, don't realize this either. Joseph P. McCarthy, famous commie hunter, was not a part of the HUAC. The HUAC was a congressional committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. McCarthy was, instead, a U.S. senator from Wisconsin. The Senate had its own investigative body, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, or PSI. It was part of the Senate Government Operations Committee, which is now the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. McCarthy was new to the Senate in 1947, but he lost no time in trying to make a name for himself as an anti-communist crusader. On February 9, 1950, he gave a Lincoln Day speech to a Republican women's club in Wheeling, West Virginia, during which he whipped out and waved at the audience documents that he claimed contained a long list of known communists working for the State Department under President Harry Truman. On that day, he claimed that the list was of 205 people. In coming weeks and months, in other speeches that featured the same flourish with papers, he constantly shifted the number, with the lowest being 57. The next morning, the local paper ran a story describing the speech. It included these words: Joseph McCarthy, Jr. U.S. Senator from Wisconsin, was given a rousing ovation last night when, as guest of the Ohio County Republican Women's Club, he declared bluntly that the fate of the world rests with the clash between the atheism of Moscow and the Christian spirit throughout other parts of the world. In spite of the obscure location of the speech, national media jumped on the story, and it created a firestorm across the land, particularly the part about the list. The Soviet Union had successfully tested an atomic bomb just 6 months earlier, and thus anxiety about the threat of Russian communism was running high in the country. The thought that communist spies could be right inside the government was understandably terrifying to the public. Just days later, McCarthy brought his list and his accusations to the Senate floor in a 5-hour-long speech, during which he gave alleged details on the subversive acts of dozens of those named on the list. The Senate, which had a Democratic majority at the time, set up a special subcommittee chaired by Democratic Senator Millard Tydings to investigate his allegations, and held hearings. As the Wikipedia article on McCarthy put it, throughout the hearings, McCarthy employed colorful rhetoric, but produced no substantial evidence to support his accusations. In fact, in spite of all the times he whipped out the papers and fluttered them at audiences across the land, he actually never showed anyone what was on the papers, and never provided an actual list to either Congress or the media. Predictably, once all the hoopla of the hearings was over, the response of the senators involved depended on which side of the aisle they sat. From its beginning, the Tydings Committee was marked by partisan infighting. Its final report, written by the Democratic majority, concluded that the individuals on McCarthy's list were neither communists nor pro-communist, and said the State Department had an effective security program. The Tydings report labeled McCarthy's charges a fraud and a hoax, and said that the result of McCarthy's actions was to confuse and divide the American people to a degree far beyond the hopes of the communists themselves. Republicans responded in kind, with William E. Jenner stating that Tydings was guilty of the most brazen whitewash of treasonable conspiracy in our history. The full Senate voted 3 times on whether to accept the report, and each time the voting was precisely divided along party lines. You've no doubt heard of the term McCarthyism, used as a synonym for demagoguery, baseless defamation of innocent people, and mudslinging. Surprisingly, the term was invented very early in McCarthy's reign of terror. Famous Washington Post editorial cartoonist Herb Bloch coined it to use in this cartoon that was featured in the paper on March 29, 1950, just weeks after Joe's speech before those Republican women in West Virginia. The names on the coats of the men are those of other Republican senators of the time who were supportive of McCarthy and his tactics. Bloch used the term McCarthyism as a label for a symbolic big barrel of black tar, teetering on top of buckets and paintbrushes that could be used to spread that tar on people's reputations. The senators are attempting to force the symbolic Republican elephant to stand on a platform underpinned by that McCarthyism. And it wasn't just liberal Democrats that criticized McCarthy's bombast very early on. A Slate magazine article in July 2018 shared some details. Only a few months after McCarthy's Wheeling speech, freshman Senator Margaret Chase Smith, a moderate Republican from Maine, gave a speech condemning McCarthy's methods, which she called the Declaration of Conscience. Smith penned what we might now call an epic takedown of McCarthy without ever mentioning him by name. The American people are sick and tired of being afraid to speak their minds, lest they be politically smeared as communists or fascists by their opponents, Smith wrote. Freedom of speech is not what it used to be in America. McCarthy called Smith and the senators who co-sponsored her declaration Snow White and the Six Dwarves, a gendered insult to his colleagues' power and self-determination that was typical of the way he spoke. Millard Tydings, the conservative Democrat who had publicly opposed McCarthy after his subcommittee found that the senator's first accusations of the State Department were unsubstantiated, got called a commie-crat and an egg-sucking liberal for his trouble. McCarthy accused the State Department of practicing powder puff diplomacy and said that communists and queers have the American people in a hypnotic trance. His opponents were always dupes and weaklings, while he was the real man who knew the score. Actually, McCarthy wasn't offended by the term McCarthyism at all. He gloried in it, and there were many Americans who thought McCarthyism was a good thing, and some still do. In fact, even in the 21st century, some politicians and pundits glory in emulating his bullying methods. As just a tiny taste of the kind of over-the-top rhetoric McCarthy indulged in throughout his career, here's a description of how he attacked Truman's Secretary of Defense, George Marshall. Marshall was a highly respected general and statesman, remembered today as the architect of victory and peace, the latter based on the Marshall Plan for post-war reconstruction of Europe, for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. McCarthy made a lengthy speech on Marshall, later published in 1951 as a book titled America's Retreat from Victory, The Story of George Catlett Marshall. Marshall had been involved in American foreign policy with China, and McCarthy charged that Marshall was directly responsible for the loss of China to communism. In the speech, McCarthy also implied that Marshall was guilty of treason, declared that if Marshall were merely stupid, the laws of probability would dictate that part of his decisions would serve this country's interest, and, most famously, accused him of being part of a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. After the election of November 1952, when Eisenhower won the White House and the Republicans captured a majority in both houses of Congress, Joe McCarthy became chairman of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and he lost no time using his position of authority to launch major committee investigations into possible infiltration of the communists into all branches of the federal government. In 1953 and 1954, the committee held 169 hearings and called over 650 people for questioning, with McCarthy constantly making accusations and intimidating those testifying. Throughout it all, he refused to reveal his sources, claiming threats to national security. These hearings destroyed the reputations of many innocent people. In January that year, at the suggestion of J. Edgar Hoover, he appointed a 26-year-old lawyer named Roy Cohn as chief counsel to the subcommittee. Cohn would play an important part in events from then on. The subcommittee first investigated allegations of communist influence in the Voice of America, at that time administered by the State Department's United States Information Agency. Many VOA personnel were questioned in front of television cameras and a packed press gallery, with McCarthy lacing his questions with hostile innuendo and false accusations. A few VOA employees alleged communist influence on the content of broadcast, but none of the charges were substantiated. Morale at VOA was badly damaged, and one of its engineers committed suicide during McCarthy's investigation. Ed Kretzmann, a policy advisor for the service, would later comment that it was VOA's darkest hour when Senator McCarthy and his chief hatchet man, Roy Cohn, almost succeeded in muffling it. Cohn gloried in his hatchet man role. The subcommittee then turned to the overseas library program of the International Information Agency. Cohn toured Europe, examining the card catalogs of the State Department libraries, looking for works by authors he deemed inappropriate. McCarthy then recited the list of supposedly pro-communist authors before his subcommittee and the press. The State Department bowed to McCarthy and ordered its overseas librarians to remove from their shelves material by any controversial persons, communists, fellow travelers, etc. Some libraries went as far as burning the newly forbidden books. Shortly after this, in one of his public criticisms of McCarthy, President Eisenhower urged Americans, "Don't join the book burners. Don't be afraid to go in your library and read every book." When he wasn't overseas looking for books to burn, Cohn was back at McCarthy's side in Senate hearings, stirring the pot. As the Washington Post put it in a September 2019 article about Cohn, McCarthy's show trials into purported communist infiltration of the American government were entering year 3 as Cohn began whispering scurrilous prompts in the senator's ear during closed-door inquisitions. The homophobic Cohn would amplify McCarthy's relentless gay baiting. That last comment was really ironic because, at the same time that Cohn and McCarthy were targeting possible communists in the government, Cohn helped wage a similar vicious campaign targeting alleged homosexuals in the government, often referred to as the Lavender Scare. Yet, the secret reality was that Cohn himself was a closeted homosexual who died of AIDS in 1986, refusing to the end to admit his sexual orientation and insisting instead that he had liver cancer. No, he didn't. He was diagnosed with AIDS in 1984, and his good friend Ronald Reagan helped him quietly to get treatment with some of the first experimental AIDS drugs. Before continuing the examination of anti-communist activities of the 1950s and 60s, it may be of relevance to explain here why we might have any interest in Roy Cohn, a figure from long ago in the 21st century, related to current events now. You may be wondering why the Washington Post had a recent article about him. As a History.com article on Cohn puts it, fast forward to Manhattan, 1973. Cohn was at Le Club, a hangout for rich people, when a man turned to him and asked his advice about Justice Department allegations that his real estate company had discriminated against black tenants. That man was future Republican President Donald Trump, who was only 27 at the time, and Cohn advised, "Tell them to go to hell and fight the thing in court and let them prove you discriminated." Soon afterward, Cohn started working as Trump's personal lawyer. Cohn served as a mentor to the businessman, helping him to navigate the world of New York's power brokers. Cohn also famously introduced him to the political strategist Roger Stone, a self-proclaimed dirty trickster who advised his presidential campaign. The Washington Post also commented in a later article in October 2019, like Trump, Cohn had the benefit of a prominent father, a New York judge who'd pulled strings to help his son gain entrance to Columbia University Law School and keep him from being drafted. And like Trump, Cohn prioritized concealment. Little about his public persona was genuine or healthy. He was a draft-dodging patriot, a Jewish anti-Semite, and a homosexual homophobe. As Cohn biographer Nicholas von Hoffman remarked, politically and publicly, Roy was the most closeted of individuals. Trump and Cohn won glowing profiles in top magazines and newspapers, and they were happily quoted praising each other. They spoke often, sometimes a dozen times a day. They joined forces to battle construction unions, win building permits, and press libel suits against critical reporters. Just to give you a feel for the type of dirty tricks Cohn was known for in the 1970s, around the time he met Donald Trump. In 1975, Cohn entered the hospital room of the dying, comatose Louis Rosenstiel, the multimillionaire founder of Shanley Industries, a well-known liquor company that made several brands of bourbon whiskey and had a controlling interest in Blatt's beer. Cohn forced a pen into Rosenstiel's hand and lifted it to the will in an attempt to make himself and Rosenstiel's granddaughter beneficiaries. The resulting scribbled marks were determined by a judge to be indecipherable and in no way a valid signature. That little incident was one of the reasons that Cohn was disbarred from the appellate division of the New York State Supreme Court in 1986. Although 1986 was a bit late in his extremely controversial career, during which he'd done a whole lot of worse things, Cohn died only 6 weeks after he'd been disbarred. It was Cohn's connection to Donald Trump that brought him to the attention of the American public again in 2017, 3 decades since he'd been in the headlines. The reason for the renewed notice of the connection was a statement made by Trump shortly after he took office. During the first month of the Mueller investigation, in a moment of frustration with the legal and public relations walls that seemed to be closing in on him, the president blurted out to his White House advisors, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" Trump obviously desperately missed having his hardened old fixer by his side as he faced bigger problems as president than he ever had in his business career. When James Comey refused to pledge loyalty to him, and Jeff Sessions chose to recuse himself from overseeing the Russian investigation, Trump wished for someone just like Cohn to come to his rescue, a new fixer who would be totally loyal to him and fight dirty if necessary to help him get out of the mess he'd gotten himself into. Not surprisingly, though, Trump had not shown a similar loyalty to Cohn in 1986. As Cohn lay dying at the National Institutes of Health Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland, Trump distanced himself from his longtime friend. Cohn believed Trump had cut him off because he was HIV positive. "I can't believe he's doing this to me," Cohn said at the time. "Donald pisses ice water." The strange relationship between Trump and Cohn even became the focus of a major documentary film about Roy Cohn's life that debuted in 2019 with a title based on Trump's famous lament, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" But let's return now to the Red Scare era of 1954, when Cohn and McCarthy were at the peak of their influence in the anti-communism movement. In an effort to reinvigorate his declining popularity, McCarthy made a dramatic accusation that was a crucial mistake. In 1954, he charged that the U.S. Army was soft on communism. McCarthy was indignant because David Schein, one of his former investigators, had been drafted, and the Army, much to McCarthy's surprise, refused the special treatment he demanded for his former aide. In April 1954, McCarthy, chairman of the Government Operations Committee in the Senate, opened televised hearings into his charges against the Army. The hearings were a fiasco for McCarthy. He constantly interrupted with irrelevant questions and asides, yelled "point of order" whenever testimony was not to his liking, and verbally attacked witnesses, attorneys for the Army, and his fellow senators. The climax came when McCarthy slandered an associate of the Army's chief counsel, Joseph Welch. Welch fixed McCarthy with a steady glare and declared evenly, "Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last?" A stunned McCarthy listened as the packed audience exploded into cheers and applause. McCarthy's days as a political power were effectively over. A few weeks later, the Army hearings dribbled to a close with little fanfare, and no charges were upheld against the Army by the committee. In December 1954, the Senate voted to censure McCarthy for his conduct. 3 years later, he died of complications from cirrhosis of the liver. The mistake I made about the Red Scare for most of my life until recently was that I read about the obvious disdain felt back in 1954 by much of the country, including his colleagues in the Senate, for the methods McCarthy chose to use in his investigations into possible communist infiltration in America. And as a result, I made the false assumption that this reflected a quickly waning interest in American society in the issue of anti-communism after his censure and death. No, the interest did not wane. Anti-communist efforts in America didn't start with McCarthy. They went all the way back to the post-World War I era of the first Red Scare. They picked up steam after World War II with the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings that particularly focused on possible communist spies and collaborators in positions in the U.S. government and on communist influence in the Hollywood film industry. And they continued with McCarthy's personal crusade that started in 1950 and led to its climax in 1954 at the Army McCarthy hearings. All of those aspects of anti-communism were basically instituted and carried out by governmental bodies and government officials, and the primary focus was on concerns about Soviet Russia as a national threat to the United States. Anyone espousing communist ideas was considered a threat because they were assumed to be likely to have as their aim to help the Russian Reds to take over America through force of arms. In the heyday of these efforts, they were big stories in the national news. What I did not realize is that, particularly beginning in the late 1940s, what you might call a whole sprawling cottage industry of creating anti-communist groups sprang up and took on a life of its own in America. I found out it was already thriving by the time of McCarthy's heyday and continued on unabated after his death, and in some ways has continued on to today. And these groups were built up and led not by congressional committees or by well-known governmental officials like Joe McCarthy, but by a wide variety of private citizens. Their primary focus was not on possible spies leaking atomic secrets to Russia. It was not on the crushing of America by communist Russian bombs and armies. It emphasized instead the seduction of the citizens of America, young and old, by communist ideas. When McCarthy became a laughingstock to the general public for being so outlandish and so despised for his destructive tactics that recklessly and viciously harmed or ruined the lives of innocent people, his particular style of anti-communism faded from notice in the public arena. When the influence of the HUAC declined in the late 1950s, without having actually ferreted out much actual communist subversion in the government or in the motion picture industry, it faded from the national news and was eventually abolished in 1975. In 1959, former President Harry Truman declared publicly that the HUAC was the most un-American thing in the country today. This was not the first time he'd had unkind words to say about the kind of reckless anti-communist efforts made by some politicians during the 40s and 50s, such as in this exchange about McCarthy with a reporter at a news conference in Key West, Florida on March 30th, 1950. Question: do you think that Senator McCarthy can show any disloyalty exists in the State Department? The President: I think the greatest asset that the Kremlin has is Senator McCarthy. Yes, when I looked back in history books and online articles about the 50s, it sure seemed to me like crusades of anti-communism went the way of the poodle skirt around the end of the 1950s. But I recently found out just how wrong I was. And one of the first things that changed my understanding was seeing stories on the internet about the 1961 School of Anti-Communism held in Los Angeles, described at the beginning of this video. That elaborate event, starring popular personalities from the entertainment industry and the political world, such as Roy Rogers and Ronald Reagan and John Wayne and Pat Boone, occurred 7 years after Joe McCarthy was censured by Congress. It occurred 4 years after he died in public infamy in 1957. It occurred just as the HUAC seemed to be losing steam. I learned from my recent research that the non-governmental anti-communist groups that flourished at the same time as McCarthy didn't fade away. They just carried on their activities under the radar of the national news media. If you traveled in certain politically conservative circles, it was these non-governmental groups that you would realize were thriving. They didn't focus on ferreting out Americans who might be stealing nuclear secrets for the Russians or be infiltrating the American government at the highest levels to attempt to influence American politics. Instead, these groups focused on what they perceived as the threat of communists surreptitiously inserting communist ideas of social organization, economic policies, and atheism into the minds of the public at large, with the intent to gradually turn the U.S. first into a socialist society led by a socialist government and ultimately into an atheistic communist society rather than a Christian-based democratic society built on the economic system of unfettered capitalism. The fear was in particular that such seduction of minds would go on in the American educational system with secretly communist teachers in grade schools, high schools, and colleges turning wholesome, Christian, patriotic American boys and girls into little atheistic, immoral, communist comrades ready to turn in their own parents to the authorities for resisting communist ideas. In the next installment of this series, we will take a closer look at that cottage industry of that Red Scare era and how it has had a continuing influence in America ever since in American Anti-Communism, Rise of the Grassroots.